The rain-soaked streets were eerily quiet as Jessica hurried towards her house, rain dripping down her face. She had just received an urgent call from her neighbor, warning her that the HOA president, Karen, had called the cops to shut down her party. Jessica's heart raced. This was no ordinary party. The governor himself was a guest, and Jessica had spent weeks planning this event to pitch him her controversial housing reform proposal. If the cops showed up, it could ruin everything. As Jessica reached her driveway, the flashing lights of police cars came into view. Panic seized her. She had to think fast. Straightening her shoulders, she marched up to the officers with an air of confidence. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Our HOA president, Karen, called you about a disturbance, but I can assure you everything is under control. This is a private event for my homeowners association." The officers exchanged a dubious glance. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about loud music and a large gathering. I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to shut it down." Jessica plastered on a concerned expression. "Officers, I understand your concern, but this is a very important meeting with our state governor. I'm sure you wouldn't want to interfere with official government business, would you?" The officers hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Jessica seized the opportunity. "Tell you what, why don't you come inside and see for yourselves? I'm sure the governor would be more than happy to speak with you." Before the officers could respond, the front door swung open, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out. "What's going on here?" the governor demanded, his brow furrowed in displeasure. Jessica suppressed a triumphant smile. "Governor, these officers were just about to join us. I was just explaining that our HOA president, Karen, called them about a disturbance, but I assured them this is a private event." The governor's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the officers. "I see. Well, gentlemen, I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining discretion in matters of state business. Perhaps you could have a word with the HOA president and encourage her to be more cooperative in the future." The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded reluctantly. "Of course, Governor. We'll handle this discreetly." As the officers turned to leave, Jessica caught a glimpse of Karen peering out from behind her curtains, her face a mask of fury. Jessica couldn't resist a small, satisfied smile. The HOA had made its move, but she had outmaneuvered them. For now. Once the officers had departed, Jessica ushered the governor back inside, her mind racing. This was only the beginning of the battle. The HOA was a powerful and ruthless entity, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their control over the neighborhood. Jessica knew she had to be one step ahead of them at all times, using their own rules and regulations against them. As the party resumed, Jessica kept a wary eye on the shadows, searching for any sign of the HOA's next move. She couldn't afford to let her guard down for a moment. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. In the end, the governor left impressed with Jessica's proposal, and she felt a surge of triumph. But as she watched the taillights of his car disappear into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was just biding its time, waiting to strike again. The battle had only just begun. The next morning, Jessica awoke to the sound of her doorbell ringing incessantly. Grogging, she dragged herself out of bed and peered through the peephole, only to be greeted by the stern faces of two HOA representatives. "Mrs. Sinclair, we need to have a word with you," one of them said, his voice dripping with barely contained hostility. Jessica took a deep breath, then opened the door with a practiced smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I do for you?" "You know exactly what this is about," the other man snapped. "Your little party last night was a clear violation of our noise ordinance, not to mention the unauthorized presence of a public official." Jessica feigned ignorance. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." The governor was a guest at a private event hosted by the HOA. "I'm sure you're aware that he has the authority to override any local regulations." The first man's eyes narrowed. Be that as it may, you failed to notify the HOA of this private event in advance, as per our bylaws. And the noise level was unacceptable, even for a private function. I apologize for any inconvenience, Jessica replied smoothly. I'll be sure to follow the proper channels in the future. Is there anything else I can help you with? The two men exchanged a glance, then the second one spoke up. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Sinclair. And let me make one thing clear. The HOA does not take kindly to those who try to circumvent our rules. With that, they turned and stalked away, leaving Jessica with a growing sense of unease. She knew the HOA wouldn't let this go so easily. They were a powerful and vindictive entity, and they had a long history of punishing those who dared to defy them. As the day wore on, Jessica's phone began to ring incessantly. First with calls from her neighbors, all of whom had received threatening letters from the HOA about the party. Then came the notices of fines and potential legal action. Jessica's stomach twisted with dread. The HOA was clearly mounting a coordinated campaign to make her life a living hell. But Jessica was no stranger to legal battles. She had spent years honing her skills as a strategic negotiator, and she knew the HOA's bylaws inside and out. If they wanted a fight, she was more than prepared to give them one. That evening, Jessica sat down at her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she drafted a series of carefully worded letters. She knew the HOA's weaknesses, their reliance on outdated and often contradictory regulations, their tendency to abuse their power, and their fear of public scrutiny. One by one, Jessica fired off her missives, each one a carefully crafted legal salvo aimed at the HOA's jugular. She cited obscure clauses, pointed out glaring inconsistencies, and threatened to take the matter to the local media if the HOA refused to back down. As she hit send on the final letter, Jessica leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. The HOA had made their move, and now it was her turn. She was ready to take them on, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jessica awoke to find her inbox flooded with frantic messages from the HOA representatives. They were clearly in damage control mode, scrambling to respond to her barrage of legal challenges. Jessica couldn't help but chuckle. She had them on the ropes, and she knew it. But even as she savored her small victory, Jessica couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the HOA was far from finished. They were a formidable opponent, and she knew that they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on the neighborhood. The battle had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The following week, Jessica's doorbell rang again, but this time it was a different set of visitors. A group of her fellow homeowners, all of them looking anxious and concerned. Jessica, we need to talk. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Marcia, said. The HOA is threatening to fine us all if we don't cooperate with their investigation into your party. Jessica's brow furrowed. Investigation? What are they talking about? Marcia's face was grave. They're claiming that you broke several HOA rules and regulations, and they're demanding that we all testify against you. Jessica's heart sank. She should have known the HOA wouldn't let this go without a fight. They were renowned for their ruthless tactics, and they had no qualms about turning her neighbors against her. This is outrageous, she fumed. They have no right to bully you all like this. We need to stand up to them. Marcia shook her head helplessly. I'm sorry, Jessica, but most of us can't afford the fines. The HOA has us over a barrel. Jessica's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She knew the HOA was counting on her neighbor's fear and complacency to intimidate her, but she wasn't about to back down. Listen, Marcia, I understand your concerns, but we can't let the HOA push us around like this. They're abusing their power, and we need to fight back. Marcia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right, Jessica. What do you have in mind? Jessica's eyes gleamed with determination. I'm going to call a neighborhood meeting. We need to band together and show the HOA that we won't be bullied. Over the next few days, Jessica worked tirelessly to rally her neighbors. She went door to door, sharing her plan and urging them to attend the meeting. To her surprise, many of them were eager to join the fight, emboldened by her unwavering resolve. When the day of the meeting arrived, Jessica was heartened to see a large crowd gathered in her living room. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady and confident. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you are worried about the HOA's threats, but we can't let them intimidate us. We have rights, and we need to stand up for them." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jessica pressed on. "The HOA has been abusing its power for far too long, and it's time we put a stop to it. They've threatened us with fines and legal action, but we have the law on our side." Jessica outlined her plan, detailing the legal strategies she had developed to challenge the HOA's actions. As she spoke, she could see the tension and fear in her neighbors' faces gradually give way to a sense of determination. "We need to show the HOA that we won't back down," Jessica concluded. "Are you all with me?" The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Jessica felt a surge of pride. She knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more determined than ever to take on the HOA and win. As the meeting drew to a close, Jessica pulled Marcia aside. "I need you to spread the word. We're going to take this fight to the HOA's doorstep. It's time to show them that they can't push us around anymore." Marcia's eyes widened, but then a grin spread across her face. "You got it, Jessica. This is war." Jessica nodded, her jaw set with determination. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was ready to lead her neighbors into the fray. The following week, Jessica and her neighbors gathered once again, this time outside the imposing gates of the HOA's headquarters. The air was thick with tension as they assembled, holding signs and chanting slogans. "No more HOA tyranny," they cried, their voices rising in a crescendo. Jessica stood at the front of the group, her eyes fixed on the building before them. She could see the HOA representatives peering out from behind the tinted windows, no doubt alarmed by the sudden show of defiance. "Keep the pressure on," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the din. "We need to show them that we won't back down." The crowd roared in response, and Jessica felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment they had been building towards. The HOA had pushed them too far, and now it was time to fight back. As the protest wore on, the HOA's representatives emerged, their faces twisted with fury. They tried to reason with the crowd, but Jessica and her neighbors refused to back down. "We won't be silenced," Marcia shouted, her voice hoarse from yelling. "This is our community, and we won't let you dictate how we live." The HOA's representatives scowled, then retreated back into the building, slamming the doors behind them. Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. They had struck a blow against the HOA's power. But the victory was short-lived. Later that day, Jessica received a call from the local police, informing her that the HOA had filed a trespassing complaint against the protesters. To her horror, she learned that they had also obtained a restraining order, barring her and her neighbors from setting foot on the HOA's property. "This is outrageous," Jessica fumed, pacing back and forth in her living room. "They're using the law to silence us." Marcia nodded grimly. "I knew they wouldn't back down without a fight. This is just the beginning, Jessica." Jessica's mind raced as she tried to come up with a new plan. She knew that the HOA was playing dirty, but she refused to be cowed. This was her home, and she wasn't about to let the HOA dictate the terms of the battle. "We need to find a way around this restraining order," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There has to be a loophole we can exploit." Marcia's brow furrowed. "What did you have in mind?" Jessica's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "We're going to take this fight to the courts. The HOA may have the law on their side for now, but I'm not about to let them get away with this." Over the next few days, Jessica worked tirelessly, poring over the HOA's bylaws and researching obscure legal precedents. She knew that the battle ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more determined than ever to bring the HOA down. As she prepared to file her lawsuit, Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The HOA was a formidable opponent, and she knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their power. But she also knew that she had the law on her side, and she was determined to use every tool at her disposal to take them down. With a deep breath, Jessica pressed the send button on her final legal filing, her eyes gleaming with determination. The gauntlet had been thrown, and the battle had begun. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension as Jessica took the stand, her eyes unwavering as she faced down the HOA's team of high-powered attorneys. "So, Mrs. Sinclair," the lead counsel began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're claiming that the HOA's actions were a blatant abuse of power. Yet you organized a protest that directly violated their own bylaws. Isn't that correct?" Jessica straightened her spine, her gaze steady. The HOA's bylaws are grossly outdated and often contradictory. They've used them as a weapon to oppress the very people they're supposed to serve. The attorney's lips curled into a sneer. "That's a bold claim, Mrs. Sinclair. Do you have any evidence to back that up?" Jessica reached into a folder on the desk in front of her, producing a stack of documents. "As a matter of fact, I do. These are copies of the HOA's own records, obtained through a Freedom of Information request. They clearly show a pattern of abuse, from unfair fines to the arbitrary enforcement of rules." The attorney's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing with each passing page. Jessica watched him closely, a small smile playing on her lips. She knew she had them on the ropes. "Objection, Your Honor," the attorney finally exclaimed. "These documents are inadmissible. They were obtained through improper channels." The judge raised a hand, silencing the attorney. "Overruled. The documents are admissible, and the court will consider them as evidence." Jessica allowed herself a moan of triumph as the attorney fumed, his face flushed with frustration. She knew that this was just the beginning of a long and arduous battle, but she was determined to see it through to the end. As the hearing wore on, Jessica methodically dismantled the HOA's arguments, citing obscure laws and precedents that seemed to work in her favor. The HOA's attorneys grew increasingly agitated, their faces etched with desperation. Finally, the judge called a recess, leaving Jessica and her neighbors to huddle outside the courtroom, their faces alight with hope. "That was incredible, Jessica," Marcia exclaimed, her eyes shining with pride. "I've never seen anyone take on the HOA like that." Jessica smiled wearily. "It's not over yet, Marcia. The HOA is a powerful entity, and they won't give up without a fight." As the recess drew to a close, the judge returned to the bench, his expression unreadable. Jessica held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. After carefully considering the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice steady and measured. "I have determined that the HOA's actions were indeed a flagrant abuse of power. The restraining order is hereby lifted, and the HOA is ordered to cease all further harassment of the residents." A cheer went up from the crowd, and Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had won the first round, but she knew the battle was far from over. As the judge banged his gavel, the HOA's attorneys rose, their faces twisted with fury. Jessica watched them with a mixture of trepidation and triumph, knowing that they would stop at nothing to regain their stranglehold on the community. But she was ready. With the law on her side and the unwavering support of her neighbors, Jessica was determined to take the fight to the HOA and emerge victorious. This was her home, and she would defend it with every fiber of her being. The stage was set for an epic showdown, and Jessica was more than ready to play her part. The victory in the courtroom was short-lived, as Jessica soon discovered. The HOA, unwilling to accept defeat, had launched a relentless campaign to undermine her and her neighbors. First, they began flooding the community with a barrage of new rules and regulations, each one more absurd and draconian than the last. Residents were fined for the slightest infractions, from having their trash cans out for too long to the improper placement of lawn ornaments. "They're trying to wear us down," Marcia said, her face etched with worry. "They know they can't beat us in court, so they're using these petty fines to bleed us dry." Jessica's jaw tightened with determination. "Well, they're in for a fight. We're not going to back down that easily." She sprang into action, rallying her neighbors and devising a strategy to combat the HOA's relentless assault. They began documenting every violation, filing appeals, and challenging the fines in court. It was a painstaking process, but they refused to be cowed. But the HOA's tactics only grew more sinister. Suddenly, homes in the neighborhood began to experience a rash of vandalism: broken windows, slashed tires, and even the occasional arson. The police were called, but they seemed powerless to stop the attacks. "This has the HOA's fingerprints all over it," Jessica said, her eyes narrow with suspicion. "They're trying to terrorize us into submission." Marcia's face paled. "But how can we prove it? They're too smart to leave any evidence behind." Jessica's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She knew that the HOA was playing a dangerous game, and she couldn't afford to let them win. The stakes were too high, not just for her, but for the entire community. "We need to find a way to catch them in the act," she said, her voice low and determined. "And I think I know just how to do it." Over the next few weeks, Jessica and her neighbors set a trap, carefully monitoring the neighborhood and installing hidden cameras in strategic locations. They waited with bated breath, their nerves frayed by the constant fear of attack. Then, one night, their vigilance paid off. One of the cameras captured a group of masked figures, donning the HOA's distinctive logo, as they vandalized a nearby home. Jessica's heart pounded with triumph as she reviewed the footage, knowing that they had finally caught their tormentors in the act. "This is it," she said, her voice quivering with a mixture of relief and determination. "We're going to take this to the police and the media. The HOA won't be able to wriggle out of this one." The next day, Jessica and her neighbors marched into the police station, the incriminating footage in hand. The officers listened with growing disbelief, their faces etched with concern. "This is a serious allegation," the lead detective said, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to investigate further, but this footage is certainly compelling evidence." Jessica nodded, her eyes narrowed with intensity. "We need you to act quickly. The HOA is a powerful and dangerous entity, and they won't hesitate to retaliate." The detective's expression hardened. "Don't worry, ma'am. We'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves." As Jessica and her neighbors left the station, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. They had finally landed a decisive blow against the HOA, and they were determined to see it through to the end. But even as they celebrated their victory, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was far from finished. They were a formidable foe, and she knew that they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on the community. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. The media firestorm that followed the release of the incriminating footage was immediate and intense. Local news outlets pounced on the story, with reporters descended upon the neighborhood in droves, eager to uncover the full extent of the HOA's corruption. Jessica found herself thrust into the spotlight, her face plastered across television screens and social media feeds. She embraced the opportunity, using the platform to amplify the voices of her fellow homeowners and shine a light on the HOA's abusive tactics. "This is more than just a neighborhood dispute," she told one reporter, her eyes blazing with conviction. "The HOA has been terrorizing us for years, using their power to line their own pockets and silence anyone who dares to challenge them." The public outcry was deafening, with local politicians and community leaders quickly joining the fray. The HOA, once a seemingly untouchable entity, now found itself on the defensive, struggling to control the narrative and contain the damage. "These are baseless allegations," the HOA president, Karen, huffed in a hastily arranged press conference. "The HOA has always acted in the best interests of the community, and we will not be intimidated by these false accusations." But the evidence against the HOA was overwhelming, and the public was no longer willing to accept their denials. Calls for a full investigation into the organization's practices grew louder by the day, putting immense pressure on local authorities to take action. Jessica watched the unfolding drama with a sense of grim satisfaction. She knew that the HOA was on the ropes, and she was determined to deliver the knockout blow. "We're not going to stop until we've exposed the full extent of their corruption," she declared, her voice unwavering. "This is about more than just our neighborhood. It's about holding powerful institutions accountable and protecting the rights of everyday citizens." As the investigation gained momentum, the HOA's tactics grew even more desperate. Mysterious accidents began to befall the homeowners who had been most vocal in their opposition, and Jessica found herself the target of increasingly brazen threats and intimidation attempts. "They're trying to scare us into backing down," Marcia said, her face etched with worry. "But we can't let them win, Jessica. Not after everything we've fought for." Jessica's jaw tightened with determination. "We're not going anywhere, Marcia. This is our home, and we're going to defend it, no matter what the HOA throws at us." With renewed vigor, Jessica and her neighbors redoubled their efforts, working tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the HOA's corruption. They pored over financial records, interviewed former HOA officials, and compiled a dossier of evidence that was slowly but surely building a devastating case against the organization. Meanwhile, the investigation by local authorities continued to make progress, with the prosecutor's office announcing that they were preparing to bring criminal charges against the HOA's leadership. "This is it, Jessica," Marcia said, her eyes shining with triumph. "We're finally going to bring them down." Jessica nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's been a long and hard-fought battle, but we're not done yet. There's still one more move to make." With that, she turned her attention to the final piece of her plan, a move that would solidify their victory and ensure that the HOA could never again terrorize their community. The stage was set for the final showdown, and Jessica was ready to deliver the knockout blow. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension as the prosecutor laid out their case against the HOA leadership. Jessica and her neighbors sat in the gallery, their eyes fixed on the proceedings with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The evidence was damning. A trail of corruption, abuse of power, and outright criminal activity that had allowed the HOA to maintain its grip on the community for years. The prosecutor painted a portrait of a ruthless organization that had used intimidation, bribery, and even violence to quash any dissent or challenge to its authority. As the trial wore on, the HOA's defense team scrambled to mount a counteroffensive, but their arguments were increasingly desperate and unconvincing. The walls were closing in, and they knew it. Finally, the judge called for a recess, and Jessica and her neighbors spilled out into the courthouse hallway, their faces alight with a sense of victory. "Can you believe it?" Marcia exclaimed, her eyes shining with pride. "We're actually going to see them go down for their crimes." Jessica nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's been a long and hard-fought battle, but we finally reached the end." But even as they celebrated, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA's influence ran deeper than they had realized. She knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their power, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. As the trial resumed, the prosecutor delivered the final blow, a carefully orchestrated plan that would strip the HOA of its authority and hand control of the community back to the residents. The HOA's representatives sat in stunned silence as the details of the plan unfolded, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and fury. They tried to protest, to mount a last-ditch effort to save their empire, but the judge swiftly shut them down. "The court has spoken," the judge declared, his voice stern and unyielding. "The HOA's reign of terror is over. From this day forward, the community will be governed by an elected board of homeowners, with strong safeguards in place to prevent the kind of abuse we've witnessed here." A cheer went up from the gallery, and Jessica felt a surge of triumph. They had won, not just a battle, but the war. As the HOA's representatives were led away in handcuffs, Jessica and her neighbors gathered outside the courthouse, basking in the glow of their victory. "We did it, Jessica," Marcia said, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "We took down the HOA, and we took back our community." Jessica nodded, her own eyes moist with emotion. "It wasn't easy, Marcia, but we stuck together. And now, we get to build something better, something that truly serves the needs of the people who live here." The two women embraced, surrounded by their jubilant neighbors, and Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief. The battle had been long and arduous, but they had emerged victorious, their community stronger and more united than ever before. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Jessica took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had been a fight for their very way of life, a battle against a powerful and entrenched entity that had sought to control and manipulate them. But they had prevailed, their determination and strategic brilliance proving to be the key to their success. And now, as they looked towards the future, Jessica knew that their community would be better for it, a place where the rights and freedoms of the people would be protected, and where the pursuit of justice and fairness would be the guiding principles. The battle might be over, but the work had only just begun.